If you're watching this video, you've probably decided to do so of your own free will. You saw the link somewhere, clicked on it, and were taken to YouTube so you could enjoy the product that you chose. This, we're told, is our most fundamental freedom as a consumer, our ability to consume whatever we want, whenever we want, without any coercion or obstacles. For decades now, our leaders have been telling us how great all these new freedoms are and how wonderful it is to be liberated of the weight of the old oppressions and welcomed into the high-speed, high-tech modern market that will fulfill all of our desires. Of course, anyone who actually takes an honest look at the state of our society can see that the modern market hasn't quite managed to live up to this lofty ideal, and in fact, many of the freedoms we were promised no longer feel so free. Why is this? What happened to the freedom that neoliberalism promised us? In this video, I want to explore one possible explanation and analysis of the current state of freedom, courtesy of recent critical theory from Byung-Chul Han and Mark Fisher. I'm going to discuss how the growth of neoliberal control society has in fact exploited freedom, and both illustrate some of its most damaging effects and propose some ways we might seek to oppose it. Now, let's grab our cowboy hats and credit cards and get ready to talk some freedom. So as I mentioned at the end there, a fundamental part of Han's theory of modern freedom has to do with something called a control society. A number of other people have already made very in-depth videos explaining this topic in much more detail than I can go into here, and I would specifically recommend Cuck Philosophy's video on the subject, which I have linked in the description and highly encourage you to watch if you want to learn more. For our purposes, I will give a relatively brief overview of what a control society is and how it relates to these new concepts of freedom. While the term control society originally comes from William S. Burroughs, its theoretical importance largely stems from a short essay by Gilles Deleuze titled Postscript on the Societies of Control, published in 1990. In it, Deleuze contrasts what he calls control societies with an earlier form of society known as a disciplinary society, and so we'll have to analyze those first. Disciplinary society is a concept developed by Michel Foucault in the mid to late 20th century. Foucault was interested in mapping how power in society has changed over time, and so his characterization of disciplinary societies are based on how power is exerted within them. In a disciplinary society, it can be said that power is top-down, external, and inhibitive. It is top-down in that there is a clear hierarchy in which those at the top observe and exert power on those below, like the boss and their worker, or the prison guard and their prisoner. It is external in that power is imposed upon you from the outside, meaning that it regulates your actions in your body, which are external, but not necessarily your mind, which can still be held privately. When you're under the view of a CCTV camera, for example, you might regulate your actions so that you don't violate any rules, but your mind is still largely your own, hidden away from the external observer. Finally, it is inhibitive in that it largely says no. You may not steal, you may not be late for work, you may not skip class. Your desires are subordinated to the desires of the power structure and are therefore inhibited to make it run more smoothly. There are, of course, many other important aspects to a disciplinary society, but these are the most important for us here. To connect it to the real world a bit more, think of the disciplinary society as the modernist society of factories, prisons, and boarding schools. People are expected to follow certain rules imposed upon them by impersonal authority structures like the state or the industry, and everything is focused on organization and efficiency. However, Deleuze argues that at the time of his writings at the start of the 90s, society had begun to transition away from this old model of the disciplinary society and was instead starting to become something new, the control society. It's important to emphasize here that Deleuze was not saying we are already entirely in a control society, or that disciplinary and controlling structures can't exist side by side temporarily. Instead, he was saying that we had begun the transition from one to the other, and so many older disciplinary forms were only just starting to break down and change. So whereas in the disciplinary society power was top-down, external, and inhibitive, in the new control society power is smart, internal, and permissive. Smart power is a term used by Byung-Chul Han to describe the new kind of power that we're starting to see develop under neoliberalism, and it is essentially different from top-down power in that it is both more quiet and more pervasive. Han points out that older power that relied on violence or repression to make itself work was actively weak because it nonetheless allowed for opposition to be formed against it in the first place. In his book Psychopolitics, he writes that power that relies on violence does not represent power of the highest order. The mere fact that another will manages to form and turn against the power holder attests to the latter's weakness. In contrast with this weaker, more basic form of power, Han posits that wherever power does not come into view at all, it exists without question. The greater power is, the more quietly it works. It just happens. It has no need to draw attention to itself. This is smart power. Power that no longer relies on top-down imposition of rules, but instead is far more quiet and without source. Because of this, it is much harder for people to oppose it, because they do not even notice it in the first place. Well, now you might ask, how is this even possible? How is it possible to have a power that you don't notice, a power that just happens? Well, to start, smart power is permissive. This means that instead of saying no and trying to prevent people from doing things like under disciplinary society, smart power says yes, and actively encourages people to consume as much as they want. No longer are you forced into a power structure by something commanding you from above. Instead, you are enticed, seduced into joining it by appealing to your desires and making you believe you chose to join freely. By convincing the subject that they are making their decisions freely, smart power manages to disappear entirely from view. This also means that smart power is predominantly internal, in that instead of an external identifiable entity exerting their power over you, now, through your own internal free will, you willingly subject yourself to subtle domination. In this way, smart power takes over the mind, since whereas under disciplinary society you could keep your thoughts to yourself and actively generate resistance to the power structure, now under smart power you do not even notice that the power structure exists, even as you are voluntarily subordinating yourself to it, therefore making it a significantly stronger type of power to Han. The power to which there is no possible opposition. Han says that instead of making people compliant, smart power makes them dependent. That was a lot pretty quickly, so let's use an illustrative modern example. Twitter. Twitter wants you to tweet, and it can be nice to, as you feel like you're freely adding your voice to a public forum online. However, what's really happening is a bit more devious. The more you post, the more you express your freedom, the more you make connections on Twitter, and the more you become dependent on Twitter. Quickly, it has become the only place to post. If you're not on Twitter, then you're missing the conversation, and then you're not making connections, and then suddenly you're not adequately expressing your freedom anymore. More importantly, the more you post, the more of yourself you give over to Twitter and its analytics. You share your life, your desires, your dreams, and all those are collected and stored on a server to be sold as data and numbers to other companies or even given to the government. Instead of a disciplinarian commanding you not to do something, Twitter very smartly begs you to do more and more so it can harvest as much data on you as possible. Suddenly, you are left having very little power over yourself and your information at all, even though it was offered completely freely. This isn't to say that there aren't still disciplinary results if you don't follow their guidelines. After all, Twitter does sometimes actually ban people for violating the rules, as rare as it may seem. What's important, however, is that now, instead of the discipline being the primary method of exerting power, it is now the last resort method that actively limits the company's power in the long run by excluding a potential customer from their service. It is far more beneficial for them to have as many people as possible posting and sharing their data than it is to be running a punitive regime of banning as many people as possible. This can partly explain their extreme reluctance to make any concerted effort in banning Nazis, because to do so would actively cost them revenue and lessen their hold over people. As of the recording of this video, the Chapo Trap House subreddit has just been quarantined by the admins for supposedly promoting violence, and while it is funny to joke at their expense, this kind of thing is exactly what I'm talking about. People were drawn to Reddit because it was a website that encouraged you to form communities and post a lot, and about anything. Like, anything. But this led people to freely giving so much of their power over to the company that the company could then shut down entire online spaces whenever they wanted to. And this issue isn't limited to just podcast subreddits. It's entirely conceivable and even probable that social media apps like Twitter would shut down leftist movements at the request of the US government, or even just their own capitalist prerogative if they ever got to a point where they actually challenged capitalist hegemony. This is a good time to expand upon another term that I mentioned earlier and I've referenced a bit throughout, but haven't really properly introduced yet: neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a pretty vague term that does get thrown around a lot, but it can largely be said to refer to a set of economic and political policies put in place by people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that was focused on deregulation, the crushing of unions, massive tax cuts for the rich, and so on. Basically, every major politician for the last few decades, up until very recently, has fallen in line behind this ideology, with its hegemony really only starting to break down with the 2008 financial crisis and completely falling apart around 2016. It's honestly not anything super new in a lot of ways, as many people have characterized it as a bit of an economic return to old robber baron capitalism, but it ties in with control societies in some pretty key ways. Firstly, it emphasizes the same kind of fluidity and ostensible opposition to old hierarchies that smart power does. It opposes the mythical slowness and inefficiency of the classic bureaucracy in favor of dynamic, goal-oriented solutions, and seeks to rapidly break down the barriers between home, school, and work as everything kind of blends together in this blur of productivity and reinvention. Possibly neoliberalism's most important lasting effect, however, has been its redefinition of the modern economic subject. Whereas previously you were defined as a worker and subject to the disciplinary rules of your boss and the market, under neoliberalism you are now primarily a consumer, and the market fits to your desires and whims. Margaret Thatcher, Grand Priestess of neoliberalism herself, famously said that there is no such thing as a society, which can be taken to mean that there is no longer any unified working class, any common identities to rally around at all, or, especially any possible revolutionary subjects. Instead, we are all just atomized individual consumers. It isn't hard to see how this reconfiguration fits neatly with smart power's drive to feed people's desires so it can collect more data and bring more people into the fold. After all, if you're a consumer, you should always be consuming more. This destruction of collective working identity in favor of individual, quote-unquote, freedom-based consuming identity also works towards smart power's goal of eliminating any possible opposition by disappearing from view entirely. After all, you're no longer opposed to your boss because you're no longer a worker. In fact, you're opposed to no one at all because the market is now giving you everything you want as a consumer. There is symbolically no more enemy within the society when all of your desires are being fulfilled. Therefore, there is no power to rebel against. So, we've just spent a lot of time looking at the development of control societies, smart power, and neoliberalism, and now it's finally time to get to that term I teased at the start of the video: the exploitation of freedom. Of course, if you were able to pick up on it, we've actually already covered the exploitation of freedom. I just haven't explicitly called it that yet. The exploitation of freedom is how smart power preys on our desires and encourages us to freely choose to become reliant on their products and insert ourselves into their systems. Whereas under disciplinary societies, freedom was something that stood in opposition to power by opposing its inhibitive nature, the permissive and seductive nature of the control society means that it not only tolerates, but actively exploits freedom to gain more power. Given this, Byung-Chul Han asserts that neoliberal capitalism should come with a warning label: protect me from what I want. So, while I've already illustrated some of the disastrous results of this exploitation in terms of our over-reliance on private platforms and the destruction of common identity in favor of the consumer identity, there's also another consequence that we'll now turn to Mark Fisher to dive into: the infantilizing effect of always having our desires fulfilled. So as we've said, a strength of smart power is its permissive nature, by which it actively works to fulfill people's desires so they will continue subjecting themselves to it. This permissive tendency, working hand in hand with the neoliberal redefinition of consumer identity, has led to what can basically be summarized as the development of a society-wide version of the old saying that the customer is always right,
The money is always right.
A good way of explaining this new attitude is through Mark Fisher's example of the modern family that he uses at the end of his book, Capitalist Realism. Fisher talks about how in older, more disciplinary families, the paternal figure typically inhibited the child's desires and taught them what to do, what not to do, and how to act based on what the parents thought was right. Now, however, quote, in a culture in which the paternal concept of duty has been subsumed into the maternal imperative to enjoy, it can seem that the parent is failing in their duty if they in any way impede their child's right to absolute enjoyment. The modern parent works obsessively to appease their child because it is no longer acceptable for the parent to be a hierarchical disciplinarian. Instead, they must be a service provider for their child's every need, making sure they are never upset or uncomfortable.
No crying.
Mom, you cannot tell the baby N-O.
Yes, N-O is a negative rejoinder. We don't want to constrain little Richard developmentally.
What are you supposed to say then when the baby is being an asshole?
So, how does this existential drive to fulfill the customer's every desire, much like the obsessive parent constantly working to appease their child, actually manifest in the world around us? Well, consider how many shitty, soulless remakes, reboots, and sequels we've seen taking over the movie industry for the past few years. People have routinely derided these films for lacking any originality, especially for the reboots of classics, but even the seemingly endless numbers of sequels and movie sagas now produce basically the same effect. Many are eager to blame greedy corporations for these films, and while there is definitely a grain of truth to that, they cannot be held solely responsible. In fact, a large part of the blame can be aimed at the ostensibly democratizing nature of neoliberalism. As I've already mentioned, one of neoliberalism's big essential boogeymen is the mythical top-down bureaucracy of the 20th century, in which all individuality is muffled and crushed through the impossibly slow and totalitarian nature of the system. Neoliberalism positions itself entirely against this, claiming the mantle of freedom and dynamism and individuality. It promised that it would deliver to us a society where everyone's voice could be heard, and that there would be a great flowering of grassroots culture, freed of the constraints of any authority figure and allowed to prosper in the marketplace of ideas. Fisher notes, however, that the exact opposite has happened. The media class's refusal to be paternalistic has not resulted in a bottom-up culture of breathtaking diversity, but one that is increasingly infantilized. Instead of seeing an explosion of varied, interesting, and challenging viewpoints, we have witnessed a gradual spread of the most banal, meaningless entertainment that relies on empty messaging to appeal to as many people as possible and to attempt to distance no one. Instead of us being trusted as adults who can handle viewpoints that contradict our own and be able to see media that doesn't fit our prefigured tastes, we are coddled like children who cannot handle anything that does not neatly match our most surface desires. It's almost no wonder that so much modern media seems to be getting more and more childish, even as it purports to appeal to audiences of all ages. Consider also the recent increase in people who seem to fly into a blind rage whenever their favorite media no longer directly appeals to their standards, such as Star Wars fans or gamers. What happens in the long term to children who are given everything they ask for? Well, they usually become spoiled, entitled, and tyrannical, much like these people who get so offended when culture is no longer made just for them. They're so used to having their every whim as a consumer answered that when creators actually decide to do something new, even if it is still just some impersonal, market-driven imperative, it is nonetheless a direct affront to these people as consumers and their constructed consumer identity. This infantilizing trend doesn't just appear in the media. Consider the rise of echo chambers online and how increasing numbers of people only get their news from sources that they already agree with. While part of this is just classic confirmation bias, it has been exponentially magnified by the algorithms of Facebook and other sites that want to present us only with content that we'll like, so we'll stay on the platform and keep giving them our data. They want us to read as many news stories as possible and smash that like button forever, giving over the entirety of ourselves in the process. By exploiting our freedom in order to keep us hooked into their power structure, these sites also reduce us to children who can't stomach anything that doesn't come from within our circle. Under neoliberalism, truly, we are all baby. But isn't this all the result of people getting what they want, someone might ask? What's so wrong with people just having their desires fulfilled? I think this is a fair question, because for sure these films and echo chambers are meeting people's desires, or else they wouldn't consistently dominate the box office like they do. Fisher responds to this, however, by saying that while these carefully crafted consumer products may fulfill some basic desire we think we have, some of the best enjoyment and intellectual fulfillment we can get are actually from things we wouldn't seek out on our own. Rather, the most powerful forms of desires are precisely cravings for the strange, the unexpected, the weird. These can only be supplied by artists and media professionals who are prepared to give people something different from that which already satisfies them. He uses the example of the BBC of his youth, which instead of just playing whatever the most people wanted to see, as they mostly do now, it would actively try to play challenging and off-the-wall media that people wouldn't expect. Quote, with the likes of Tinker, Tailor, Soldier Spy, Pinter Plays, and Tarkovsky seasons. It was this BBC that also funded the popular avant-gardism of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which embedded sonic experimentation into everyday life. Such innovations are unthinkable now that the public has been displaced by the consumer. So then, how do we escape this infantilizing spiral of meaningless media and the broader social context of the exploitation of freedom that spawned it in the first place? Well, one answer is certainly a return to old-fashioned disciplinary paternalism, and as we can clearly see, many people have already started to shift towards this in their search for meaning. For us on the left, however, Fisher posits that we must instead look beyond our current situation and towards the future, not back towards the past, as such futile efforts to regain what has already been lost usually result in only the worst kinds of failure that a society can produce. Our only option is the future, and we must put all of our efforts towards creating a better one. At base, it will require an undermining of smart power and the exploitation of freedom that sustains it, and the best place to start is by coming to the understanding that the freedom that we have been promised by neoliberal consumerism is not really freedom at all. We are told that as consumer individuals, the highest form of freedom we can express is our ability to purchase goods on the market.
I work hard and I want my money to work hard too. So I use my Freedom Unlimited card. My Freedom Unlimited card. My Freedom Unlimited. My Freedom Unlimited.
And it is exactly this freedom that is being exploited. However, this supposed freedom is lacking in a few key ways. Firstly, it is inherently limited to the market. Anything not provided by the capitalist system is not offered, and therefore cannot be attained through this type of free activity. Han writes that free choice is eliminated to make way for free selection from among the items on offer. Secondly, consumerist freedom is limited by its individualism. The word freedom comes from an Indo-European root meaning love or friendship, conveying the idea of freedom being something that is attained through community and relationships with others, not just some atomistic imperative. Marx himself defined freedom in terms of a successful relationship to others. Only in community with others does each individual have the means of cultivating his gifts in all directions. Only in the community, therefore, is personal freedom possible. It is also important to point out what the real issues with neoliberalism are. The system didn't fail to create a grassroots upswell of authentic media because there is something inherently soulless about the democratic mantle that neoliberalism had claimed for itself, as the authoritarian right might have you believe, but instead because its push for democracy was not based on authentic freedom of expression, but rather a bastardized consumer freedom that was exploited to produce the awful media we received. If we actually fight for a bottom-up culture on the basis of real, community-oriented freedom instead of consumer freedom, we can create the kind of meaningful and varied media we are so desperately in need of. In terms of more material strategy, it is important to focus on how smart power makes us dependent on it. You want to participate in the conversation online? Smart power says go ahead. But you have to use one of our corporate sites like Twitter or Facebook that just also happens to collect all your data. You want to travel the world? Please, smart power says, travel as much as possible. Just make sure that you're only using our airlines that collect your biometric data too. How does smart power passively force us to use its products and subjugate ourselves to their systems like this? By depriving us of any other options. This is also naturally a big part of neoliberalism, and how focused it is on constantly destroying open common spaces in favor of privatizing everything. This is most apparent in geographical spaces like the city, where there were once more public spaces that people could gather freely without handing over their power to another entity. But now that more and more spaces are becoming enclosed and privatized, it is harder for organizers to escape their power. The same can be seen online. Whereas in the early days of the internet, it was a veritable free-for-all, where people could post on their own sites to have their voices heard, and there were high hopes that it would become a great equalizer of voices and information. The modern internet is now highly privatized and enclosed, meaning that if you want to gather any influence, you have to move through privately owned, pre-established channels like YouTube, Instagram, or any other site. The left must work to create its own platforms and spaces outside of the influence of capital if it is to stop giving over everything to these businesses and the state. Groups like Means TV are already putting this idea into practice by creating explicitly socialist media sites, and I hope others will join them soon too in other areas. For the time being, I myself am on YouTube because, as I have said, we have been deprived of any other options. Finally, I want to return to Byung-Chul Han's statement, "Protect me from what I want." This is not a blanket indictment of desire. Instead, he explicitly says that this is a mantra that must be repeated specifically under neoliberal capitalism because it is set up and sustained by the abuse of our wishes. Indeed, because of smart power's ability to disappear from view and disguise itself as a free choice, we must take special care to be critical of decisions we might otherwise take for granted, even something as small as sharing our information online or watching a YouTube video. If we are to cut through all of the illusions of the control society and make a real effort to retake our freedoms, we must explicitly identify our enemies, the methods by which they control people, and show those same people that a better world is possible. To win, in short, we must be smarter than smart power and freer than freedom.